The 1980s saw a resurgence of vampires on the big screen, leading to the decade becoming a goldmine of several beloved cult classic vampire films, many of which still to this day are considered among the genre's very best. But one of the most notable and arguably the film that started the resurgence in the first place was 1985's Fright Night, that in addition to being a love letter to classic horror films, also became one of the most influential and beloved horror movies of the 1980s. Greetings all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to another retrospective video. Today we're going to be talking about Fright Night. The film follows Charley Brewster, played by William Ragsdale, who is a fan of a late-night horror show called Fright Night, hosted by a former horror movie vampire hunter, Peter Vincent, played by Roddy McDowall. Charley discovers that his new next-door neighbor, Jerry Dandrige, played by Chris Sarandon, is secretly a vampire and responsible for the disappearances of several victims. Charley then attempts to convince his mother, his girlfriend Amy, and his best friend Ed of what he has seen, but none of them seem to believe him. And after being threatened by Jerry Dandrige himself, Charley later turns to Peter Vincent for help. But Peter dismisses Charley as an obsessed fan. But Amy, fearing for Charley's sanity and safety, later hires Peter to prove that Jerry is not a vampire by having him drink what they claim is holy water, but is actually only tap water, as Jerry claimed to Peter that drinking actual holy water would be against his religious convictions. But after the demonstration is successful, Peter accidentally discovers Jerry's true nature after glancing at his pocket mirror and noticing that Jerry casts no reflection. And after both Ed and Amy are later turned into vampires themselves, Peter reluctantly agrees to help Charley put an end to Jerry Dandridge's reign of terror. The film was written and directed by Tom Holland. No, not that one. The Tom Holland who had previously written the screenplays for Class of 1984, Psycho 2, and would later go on to direct another 80s horror classic, Child's Play. Holland, in his directorial debut, made the film as a labor of love for classic horror movies, particularly the old Universal monster classics and Hammer vampire films, and the character of Peter Vincent was modeled after classic horror actors like Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, which is also how Holland came up with the name Peter Vincent, and essentially modeled Charley Brewster after a younger version of himself. The character of Charley, I would say, is really what makes this film so accessible and relatable to horror fans, and the whole aspect of no one believing him because of his obsession with horror films is very much a contemporary take on the classic Boy Who Cried Wolf story. The concept of referencing movies within movies was still relatively new by this point, and really marked the start of this trend in horror films in general, with movies like Return of the Living Dead, Jason Lives, and The Monster Squad having similar influence and coming out around the same time, all of which paved the way for movies like Scream much later on. And Chris Sarandon is perfectly cast as Jerry Dandrige, managing to be both sensuous and terrifying at the same time, and even as the viewer you feel conflicted as to whether to be frightened of him or to embrace his darkness, making him one of the all-time great vampires in horror history. But the real star of the show are the incredible and imaginative practical effects created and developed by Richard Edlund and his team, which were just coming off of another 80s classic, Ghostbusters. The soundtrack, I would say, is another element that manages to elevate the film, with the main score being done by Brad Fiedel, who also did the score for The Terminator just 1 year before. And when the film was released in 1985, it was a success at the box office, making $24 million against a budget of $9 million, leading to a sequel, Fright Night Part 2, released in 1988. This time, it was directed by longtime John Carpenter collaborator and Halloween Free director Tommy Lee Wallace, and saw the return of Roddy McDowall and William Ragsdale as Peter Vincent and Charley Brewster. taking place 3 years after the first film and relocating the setting to a college campus. Charley, after psychiatric therapy, now believes that Jerry Dandrige was just a serial killer posing as a vampire and that vampires don't exist at all. But while visiting Peter's apartment with his new girlfriend Alex, Charley discovers that his new neighbors are in fact vampires, led by Regine, the sister of Jerry Dandrige, along with a werewolf, a bug-eating servant, and a vampire on roller skates. Fright Night Part 2 is, for the most part, a very respectful and entertaining sequel that does a pretty great job at capturing the same tone and feel of the first film, while also being able to add its own elements as well. The only minor problem I have, and maybe I'm just underestimating the power of really good therapy here, but the idea that Charley has somehow been convinced that vampires aren't real, especially after all of the events of the first film, seems a little hard to believe. But despite a slightly rough start, the film gradually improves as it goes along and leads to a pretty awesome third act that makes this a somewhat underrated and overlooked sequel. And just like any successful and beloved horror film, Fright Night would get the remake treatment in 2011, starring the late Anton Yelchin as Charley Brewster, Colin Farrell as Jerry Dandrige, and David Tennant as Peter Vincent. As far as remakes go, this one isn't too bad. It's competently made, but takes a lot of creative liberties with the original material, and makes several changes to the characters and story that are very perplexing to say the least. And in trying to modernize the story, it ultimately loses everything that made the original so special in the first place. It's not the worst remake ever made, but it's certainly not the best either. It was then followed by a direct-to-video sequel in 2013 titled Fright Night 2: New Blood. But despite being called Fright Night 2, this isn't actually a sequel at all, but rather another remake that reimagines Jerry Dandrige as a female college professor, seeming to take some influence from the original Fright Night Part 2. It brings back most of the main characters from the first film, but once again they're all recast, so is it a sequel, is it a remake, or what is it? I'll tell you what it is, it's a low-budget vampire movie with an identity crisis that's not really worth watching. Overall, the original Fright Night is easily one of the best horror movies to come out of the 1980s, that works on multiple levels, not just as being a great vampire movie, but a labor of love to horror movies in general. Tom Holland's inspiration and love for the genre combined with the talents of all of those involved not only made it a loving tribute to classic horror, but made it a classic unto itself. That's not just one of the best of the decade, but one of the best vampire movies ever made. Thanks for watching this retrospective video. Be sure to subscribe for more videos, and until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and I will see you in the next video.